our tutorial on combat broadsword. It's been long awaited. We gave you guys plenty of time to practice your concepts of distance, but now we're going to talk a little bit about ways to control distance. We alluded to that in our last video. As a quick refresher, we're talking about bridging the gap, or bridging, between being out of distance with an opponent and close enough to deploy the kinds of attacks that you want to use. Especially with a broadsword, we typically want to fight from close. We don't want to fight at a fairly long range because the broadsword is a heavier weapon, and a lot of that weight is often out toward the tip. So if we're making a lot of really reaching cuts, we're going to be wearing ourselves out. We want to be close to our opponent while we're doing these maneuvers. So we want to make sure that we can get close to make that happen, so that we're not making a lot of really reaching attacks, okay? Last time we talked about moving through that distance, and we talked about making sure that you have control of your opponent's blade. And control of the blade is a big part of bridging, because if I control my opponent's blade, they can't hit me, because I've got control of their blade. Whether it's physical control because I've actually engaged and moved that blade, or whether it's control by forcing their action, making a cut that requires their parry or block, coming in and opening up in a way that drives them to attacks that I can then parry and riposte. However I'm doing that, I can control the blade. But today we're going to talk about something a little bit different. We're going to talk about actually controlling the distance. Because certainly I can just move towards an opponent and try to bridge that ground, I can control their blade, but my opponent can move too. And what that means is if my opponent wants to keep me at a longer distance, say for instance my opponent is using a pole weapon, or even a straight sword which is fought out with the tip of the weapon, they want to keep me out at that longer distance because as a broadsword fighter it puts me at a disadvantage. So how do I make sure that when I want to close that gap, the gap actually closes and I don't spend all this time trying to engage and control their blade and chasing them around or trying to draw them in and them always hovering right at that outside distance? How do we actually control the distance in combat? Now, just like the concepts of distance, a lot of this is going to be familiar to you if you've done some empty hand combat, because a lot of these ideas are similar in empty hand combat. But with the blade, it becomes all the more important because, like I mentioned in the last video, a couple inches in a sword fight can make a huge difference because you don't get to make a lot of mistakes when you're dealing with a sharp weapon, okay? So the two things that I'm really going to talk about is distance and tempo, because those are going to be the two things that we're going to manipulate in order to control that distance. We're going to start by talking about distance itself. And what I want to do is not control the distance, but control the perception of distance. Because I want to control the actual distance by deceiving my opponent's perception of distance. And there's a number of ways to do that. When a person is sword fighting, it is typical that what they're going to focus on is the position of their opponent's weapon. You can use this to your advantage in two ways. One, you can be aware that this is a bad idea. Number two, you can be aware that your opponent is probably doing this, and you can create a deception using that reach of the opponent's blade. Which is to say, if I'm in my typical ready position, and I'm fighting with my opponent and I make an attack, and I leave my hand floated just a little bit farther out there, their natural inclination is going to be to believe that I am taking up more space than I actually am. And if I consistently leave that blade a little bit out there, they're going to get used to this being how they gauge how far away I am. I throw attacks from here, I make my reaching attacks from here, I make all my movement from here, and they get used to gauging. Now as I'm fighting, if I start to ease this blade back and pull this hand in a little bit, what that's going to do with a lot of opponents is they're going to track that blade, and they're going to follow that blade. And what that means is as I move that blade in, they're going to ease in a little bit closer. And what I've done is I've deceived distance, and I've probably picked up at least one, if not more, of those distances. So if my opponent is playing from out of distance and sort of darting into reaching distance, what I've done is I've brought them into an immediate reaching distance, or maybe even a little bit further into just in distance, where I can just reach out and hit them now by simply deceiving that distance. I can do the same thing with my actual stance. So I can do a similar thing with my actual stance. If I'm here, I can start easing not only my blade back, but I can start floating that front foot back a little bit. I can even start loading my back leg, because what's going to happen is as I collapse back, the underlying energy of the fight is going to be growing smaller on my side. And an opponent, if they're not keenly aware of what you're doing and really paying attention to the actual position of your body and even the position of your back foot, they're going to follow that energy in. They're going to draw in, draw in, draw in, and especially if I've loaded that back leg, that gives me a lot of explosive force to then close that ground very rapidly and very suddenly into that space that they thought they were in control of, but I've sort of lured them in. Now, of course, as you do this, you need to have that awareness like we talked about in our previous video of what those distances are, because as they're getting closer to you, You are controlling the distance because you're creating that deception, but they are still getting closer to you, so it is also easier for them to hit you. You have to be aware of that. You have to be aware of your opponent's distance and where their blade is, even as you're luring them in, so you can make this explosive sudden attack from what they thought was a more open distance. Now, the other thing we're going to talk about is tempo. When I used to coach fencing for the University of Houston, I talked to my fencers a lot about dance and about dancing. And about being a good dancer is great for being a good swordsman because you learn rhythm and tempo. Bump, 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 bump. Fights tend to pick up a tempo. It's just a natural thing that happens when two opponents are working against each other. They fight. Ba-bump, 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 ba-bump. Even when they're doing their footwork, they tend to fall into sort of a rhythm. They're chasing each other, they're moving, they're testing, they're moving, they're moving, they're moving, they're testing. And that tends to happen at a specific pace. And that is the tempo of the fight. Bump, 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 bump. Another great way to control the distance is to deceive tempo. And what I'm talking about there is slowing down and speeding up and adding beats to that rhythm. So if I'm moving, bump, 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 and all of a sudden I want to close ground with my opponent and I'm bump, 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 bump. What I've done is I've added a beat into that tempo. I took my step on the half beat instead of the full beat. And what that does is if my opponent doesn't adjust rapidly to that and take that same half beat movement, I have now closed ground on them before they were prepared for that, and we are now operating at a shorter distance. Now again, you need to be aware of your opponent's reaction where their blade is, because when you suddenly close that ground and take that half beat tempo, they will likely react, and one of those reactions might be to simply throw that blade out there and try to back you off. So you have to be ready for that, either by, with that half-beat engagement, connecting to their blade so you can displace that, or simply being ready that as you come in, if they throw an attack, you can then pick that up and close the remainder of the ground that you're looking for. But that sense of deceiving tempo and that sense of deceiving distance can both be very, very powerful, okay? You can practice this with a partner. What you do is you both line up and you start to move back and forth. One of you is going to be the aggressor, the other is the passive person. And the goal of the aggressor is going to be to close ground and actually physically touch your opponent. You don't even need a weapon for this. The goal is just to get close enough to physically put your hand on your opponent. Now, the opponent can't just run away. They've got to try to maintain a specific distance. What they want to do is they want to stay just out of distance. If they get too far beyond that, then they lose. They want to stay just out of distance, and your goal is to use this sense of distance and timing to try to deceive them in close enough that you can catch them off guard and make that touch. Put your hand on them and say, okay, I was able to deceive that distance. You can practice these techniques because these are not things easily learned. These are things that are going to be going on undercurrent. Because if you've got a sword in your hand and you're fighting someone, this is going to be the first thing on your mind. Their sword is going to be the first thing on your mind. And that exchange of blades is going to be right on the surface. But if you practice this diligently and really get it into the muscle memory, really get used to this type of motion, this sense of boom, 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 and inserting those half beats, it's going to be something that's going to become very natural and you're going to be very effective at, okay? So practice that, because if you get good at that, you're going to win more fights on distance than you ever are on good blade technique, and that's a fact. Control the distance, control the fight, okay? Control the spice, control the universe, but that'll be a whole other video, okay? So, go ahead and click like so everybody knows how great we are. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss things. We're going to be making a lot more videos really soon. I know we've been gone for a while, but we're back in force, so make sure you subscribe to catch all this stuff. Share it out on your Facebook. Tell all your friends. Shout it to the heavens. Heck, take out a billboard. We're that great. We'll see you guys next time. Practice like crazy. We'll see you guys later.